So maybe I can assume we're all back, right? Okay, now carry on. I guess my computer time should be precise. So we're looking at two coupled neurons that are making these loops. So just explain, so one neuron inhibiting the other neuron. And so in this mental simulation, I want to derive that it creates some kind of inhibitory competitive coupling. And I'll take you just through this logic. So here's the dynamics of neuron number one as a function of U1. And I'm assuming for the moment that neuron number two is above threshold. So it's positive, has a positive level of activation here, positive. And therefore, its sigmoid returns values. And because of this coupling, that means it does have a negative influence on the dynamics, on the rate of change of U1. So it would be shifting the rate of change of the neuron one that it would have with its input here present, would shift that down. And therefore, the attractor that results for the neuron number one here was chosen to be, assumed to be such that this neuron is subthreshold is negative. Although it gets input, it has a negative level because of that inhibition. And because it has a negative level of inhibition, it does not inhibit neuron number two because it's below threshold, right? So this term plays no role. So this term, that neuron is unchanged. So when both neurons get this input, this is a possible solution that neuron number two is on and neuron number one is off. And you could see that nothing in this explanation relied on any particular values of the parameters for U1 and U2. So if you assume that everything is symmetric, the parameters are the same, the inputs are the same, the coupling is the same, then by symmetry, you could say the other case in which neuron number two is off and neuron number one is on is also a possible solution. So what you have is a pattern of solutions where the two neurons always have the opposite sign. One is on, the other is off, and vice versa. And that's what we call a competitive solution. That is, the two neurons, even though they do receive inputs, they cannot be on at the same time. That involves some kind of selection, right? If you think of a neuron becoming activated, positive downstream effect, then here one of the two is selected for activation, the other is not. Again, this is all based on both neurons receiving inputs. So both neurons could be potentially activated. That is, in the absence of this competitive coupling, both neurons would be selected, but only one of them is selected when you have this competitory coupling. So that's the property that mutual inhibition creates. And again, I wanted to go to the simulation. I think I have it here in the background, or just, yeah, here. So running. We can implement that here by removing the self-excitation, and then I have a connection strength, and I can just connect neuron number two to neuron number one, again, maybe -5, and have a similar connection strength of neuron number one to neuron number two, -5. That would be inhibitory coupling. You see at the moment, nothing. They're both neurons are below threshold. So actually, let's make a little bit of noise in both of those neurons just so that we see something, but not for it to be important. And the only way for me to get something is to push one of those neurons above 0. And see, now it's slightly above 0, and that has already led to a lot of inhibition because the sigmoid is saturating quite quickly. Inhibition to the other neurons. So this was shifted down, and this is the off solution. Neuron number two, however, here had no input, right? I didn't. But I give it the same input. Let's say I have an input of 5.4. Here, I give it even a little bit more, 5.8. But this neuron remains below threshold. This one is above threshold. So I've selected number one, and I've selected it here really just because I can't move both of those. Somebody wants to ask a question, or is that a mistake? Maybe it's a mistake. So neuron number one was selected essentially because I can't move the sliders at the same time. So I first activated the slider for neuron number one and only then the slider for neuron number two. And that's actually a very general idea that applies to neural networks as well. When you think of neural networks, think of winner takes all, sort of an idea like that. And the idea would be that the neurons to which the input matches best, in terms of the synaptic pattern, wins, right? And what actually happens is when it matches well, that means that its input is effective input, multiplying the connectivity pattern. The effective input is larger than to those neurons that are not matching so well. And when it has a large input, that means its activity rises faster and it reaches threshold earlier and has a time to suppress everyone else. So a competitive advantage comes from an input advantage that is translated into a time advantage. That has limits because I can actually push neuron number two so high, much more input, that it now is activated and it inhibits neuron number two, neuron number one. And if I now go back to that same symmetrical situation, now I stay in this mode that is neuron number one is on and neuron number two is off. And that reflects that it's a bistable. Both of these solutions are possible. I can select one or I can select two. And again, it's self-stabilizing. That is, if I have selected one, I'm going to stay with that selection, even as, for instance, the other neuron gets more in strength up to a limit. And beyond that limit, I switch allegiance, and then I stay with that new decision. Now, that's a very general principle of decision-making in neurodynamics. Good. So the neural fields, so that was the two simple limit cases. Now it turns out that the neural fields are just doing these two things. So self-excitation and competition together make neural fields. It's kind of interesting, right? It's very simple. And the idea how they do that is that they have both. They have excitatory interaction within a local environment of any location, and that sort of stabilizes peaks from decaying. So if you have some input, there will be more activity here through local excitatory interaction. And then they have inhibitory coupling or negative competitive coupling across larger distances, and that will enable selection, so that if you, for instance, you select this location as a peak and suppress this location. And it's this property of the sigmoid that makes that at that location, even though there's sizable input, you don't get suprathreshold activations, you don't get a chance to reversely inhibit the first location. I'll take you through this now in a little more detail. And so the mathematics of fields is really just a continuous space version of the dynamics we already looked at. So rather than give indices to these variables, we write them down as functions of an underlying dimension. So X is a continuous index, if you want. So everywhere I had U1 versus U2 dot, and I now have U of X dot and U of X. And the inputs can vary continuously. And then the interaction pattern is now a integral rather than a sum over the inputs. So previously, in a discrete network, I would sum over all the neurons here. I'm integrating over all other locations X prime. And in each case, the activation that is suprathreshold at that location X prime contributes. When there is no activation, no contribution, no positive contribution. And the weight with which these different locations contribute is governed by what we call a kernel. So it's a connectivity, a recurrent connectivity or coupling function that depends on the distance between the location we're looking at and the location X that we're summing over. So this kernel here has this characteristic shape where it's positive for small distances and negative for large distances. This is a possible mathematical form. This would be sometimes called this the Canadian hat. If it goes back to zero, it's sometimes called the Mexican hat. So if the inhibitory function is also sort of limited in range. Now this is a neural network. with continuously many neurons, but it has very few parameters, right? It has the excitatory strength, the inhibitory strength, that has the width of this excitatory region. This is the other use of sigma, right? This is the conflict that some people pointed out when we edited the book, that this sigma and that sigma are different sigmas. But, you know, can deal with that, I think. So it's much lower dimensional parameter space than general neural networks, right, with discrete connections between every units. So that's the generic form of the neural fields. It goes back to Wilson Cowan and Amari, who discussed these kinds of equations as biophysical models of the dynamics in cortical layers. While we use these, you will see, in a more abstract population level sense. And I'll get to that in a moment. So to point out the connection to what I did so far we looked at different discrete neurons that we thought is sampling the field at some location. So for instance, I had a location where U1 was measured, and a location where U2 was measured. The self-excitation was essentially within that region, the effective mutual excitation, similar here. And then these two regions were mutually inhibitory. And it might depend on how far these two locations are from each other, how strong the inhibitory coupling was. And now I'm expanding that, and it's the inhibition is just a question of the distance between locations as far as described by that kernel. So let's simulate that. And for that, I have to go to a different simulator, which I have here, the one layer field simulator. And I'll be loading here. This is, you can load different interaction functions. I think I'm loading this one. So in this simulator, you have a static picture at the bottom that illustrates the interaction kernel. It's as a function of the distance in, along that dimension X, which we call feature space here. So this is where 0 is. This is the 0 horizontal axis. So this is the excitatory part of the kernel. And you see then this is a constant inhibition, the inhibitory part of the kernel. You can actually reshape that kernel. You can vary its local excitation. You can vary here how strong that global inhibition is. And you can also make a Mexican hat. That is, you can introduce a Gaussian inhibition. Currently, I just want to use this default one. Here on top, you have 3 curves. The blue is the activation level of the field. It's currently fluctuating around -5, the resting level, -5. There's some noise here that makes it fluctuate. And then below that blue is a green that you'll see in a moment. The green is the resting level plus any inputs. And these buttons here on the right control the inputs. You can, it's pre-programmed 3 kind of inputs, 3 Gaussians, the width of which can be controlled, the position of which can be controlled, and their strength or amplitude can be controlled. You can also control the time scale of the dynamics. The red line is the sigmoid applied to the blue line. So currently it's all 0. So I wanted to demonstrate to you a couple of the instabilities and solutions here. So first, let's look at just the solutions themselves. So I'm adding a little input, so it's much, for instance, here. You see the blue line follows the green line, right? And so that's the low pass filter property. And just a question of the speed of the simulator that makes this visible. It's theoretically tied to this time scale. So as long as they stay below 0, there is no interaction, right? This integral doesn't carry any term. And so it's just low pass filter. Now, if I go high enough, right here, something happens. You see, didn't touch the button anymore, right? You see there's some event happening, a detection happening. It's the same detection as we looked at in these discrete neurons. So what happened is that now there is more activation here than input. So this is input plus resting level. So the low pass filter solution is blue equals to green, right? U equals H plus S was the fixed point solution. So that will be blue equals to green. But here there's more excitation. The self-excitation, you see the red curve, which is plotted on different scale. The red is actually goes from 0 to 1, and we're plotting it 10 times larger to just make it more visible. So that really explains why there can be more activation than input, because the peak is pulling itself by its own hair. in the metaphor of some Germans might know that fairy tale of Munchausen pulling himself up by his hair out of up. That sort of self-excitation that does that. And now everywhere else, the activation level is actually suppressed below the resting level. That's this positive peak using the negative part of the kernel to suppress the field everywhere. So that's how you see it's certainly qualitatively different from that low-pass filtered solution. Now this occurs at that particular point when the input just pushes the field through zero, so that these positive sigmoid arises. When I move that higher, it deforms a little bit, quantitative way, but qualitatively it's not really different from the peak when it first arises. If I go to lower levels of input, like this one here, then the peak persists. Now, this is a level at which I can also have the green solution, the blue equals the green solution. For instance, I can reset the field to the initial condition and have that subthreshold solution. And so it's really bistable in that regime. And what actually happens is that we call that the subthreshold solution. This one here becomes unstable. So if I increase it, it becomes unstable, no longer exists. And I switch to that solution. But this peak solution has been sitting around there. That is, if I go lower, I continue to sit in that, because here the system is actually bistable. It's the same idea as in the discrete neuron, now in the continuous field. And then the reverse detection instability is when I lower this enough, essentially so that the positive activation dies out, then the peak becomes unstable. I'm going to the only available solution. Now it's monostable off, monostable subthreshold, right? So there's a regime where a peak becomes stable or is unstable. So that's the detection instability in this field. Let's go back and let's now look at selection. So for instance, I can just add another input here at some other location. You see it's the same size, suprathreshold input, but the field does not reach this level because this peak suppresses the input here. You see quite a distance to that solution. And so again, this selection occurred because I put input here first. And so activation was present and was able to suppress the system, the activation here. If I had induced this peak first, for instance, like that, and then I add this contribution, then it stays with that solution. That's the same principle I just showed you, that input advantage, time advantage leads to competitive advantage is sort of the principle. There are limits to this time advantage in that, if I push this hard enough so that the system can go through this detection instability, then I can switch the system around. And now, even though I might have more input, let's say here on the second one, see I have quite a bit of space, more input here, I stay with my initial decision. Should say that it's also possible to have multiple peaks. This is a case where there is a lot of global inhibition. I have, actually, I can do that by, maybe like this. And this was actually not what I wanted, but it is an example of that. I have a Gaussian kernel that inhibitor kernel, so inhibition peters out at large distances, now can put more than one peak into the field at the same time. So we're sometimes interested in multiple, single peak versus multiple peak solutions, and that's just a parameter question of how strong the inhibitory or what the spatial shape of the inhibitory interaction is. Let's go back to the kernel we are interested in originally, and I want to illustrate one more point, two more points actually about this. So one is let's give it just a little bit of, maybe I just here, there's a little bit of input. See, there's a little bit of an input here, not anywhere near enough to put the system through the instability. And now just give this whole system a boost. I give a constant input to the system. And where it will reach threshold first is around here, right? See here, and a peak forms. So you see that you could say that you can disentangle in the field two sources of specification. One is where the peak arises. That will be this little competitive advantage here to this location. And the other is that a field is supposed to arrive. That is the go signal, if you wish. And that can be represented by a boost that doesn't contain information about specifically which response you want. And that's also a very important principle that we're using often in our architectures, where we're using boosts like that to make a field make a decision, a selection decision, and so on, and amplify any differences between different locations. And related to that idea, let's maybe go back. There are, these, technically speaking, it's still a detection instability. It's just around very low levels of input. And here I'm choosing little inputs around these three locations that all have the same size, and they're very small. With the naked eye, you don't even see these little advantages. And I'll now be pushing the system through the detection instability by just adding this boost. And if I do this right at some point, through the little fluctuations, a peak will form around any of those three locations. It will only arise at one of those three locations. If I repeat that enough times, I should be able to get the peak to form in any of the three locations. So there's several things remarkable about that. First of all, see, if you look at the peak, that is like a regular peak. It looks like these peaks that I had before. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference, even though it is really largely just dominated by interaction. It did not, it's minimally formed by this local input. So it shows up here at the same location. And second, this amounts to a discretization or categorical responding, right? Just little inhomogeneities in the field, here modeled just by little inputs, but they could be could have arisen from, for instance, having slightly inhomogeneous coupling, really, or inhomogeneous inputs that not all the connection strengths are the same. They will be amplified in this way, and that will lead to macroscopic manifestations. You know, this full peak that, as I was just hinting, seems like I never get the peak on the right, even though at some point I should get it on the right as well. Yeah, and the implication of that is that I ultimately really lower the demands on learning. So for the system to learn a particular pattern, all I have to do is give a little competitive advantage to one particular location. I don't need to learn the, a response that the difference between the different patterns is macroscopic already, because this mechanism can amplify small differences that exist between the different possible solutions. I've had this before, that for a very long time I didn't get one of those three. Yeah, there it is. So it's really just a reflection of randomness. And you see, random fluctuations are really max here amplified into a macroscopic decision. It's the instability again that does that. And they only matter when I'm right there at the instability. So now I can add a lot of noise. Once I've made the decision, I can add a lot of noise. It will not change anything. It will never decay here. And you see how far that location is from creating a peak, very far. You will never spontaneously do that. But if I go through the instability, then I get really random decisions. Yeah, I think those are the points I need to make. Let me remind myself if I did all of those. Oh no, I forgot one, which is the working memory situation. So let's just reset that here. Oh, it doesn't. Let's put that to the regular -5. And so I like to illustrate this with the same parameters. So this was what I had before. Let's add a little more noise. And this is still, oops, sorry, did a lot of just in the slider here, like this maybe. So it still follows the input in the sense it goes through reverse detection instability every time I remove the localized input. But I can create conditions under which that's not the case. So one simple case, that's what I'm doing here, is just boosting the whole field, which reduces the distance between the solutions and detection, which I just illustrated. And under such conditions, I can get sustained activation. This would be an example of sustained activation. So I have no localized input. Oh, sorry, these are actually still a little bit on, but here no localized input. But I have a stable activation peak that looks like a regular peak, right? It's not really much smaller than when I have local input. And it's only there because there was a peak previously. So it remembers that state. It's self-excitation that keeps that peak in place. And the inhibition prevents it from spreading out, right? If it has only excitation at the boundary, the peak would always excite the neighbor and so on, and then it would spread. And that would be a problem. I can demonstrate that if I reduce global inhibition, you see how the peak would be spreading forever, and that ultimately could really wreak havoc, right? So I don't want that. Yeah, so this is the standard model of working memory. We call that sustained activation, so activation that remains once input has been removed. There are wrinkles on that literature. There's limited capacity, which makes a lot of sense in these models. That is, if you add more peaks at some point, peaks will start to delete each other because there's inhibition is accumulated. Each peak inhibits the others by this amount, and that will ultimately limit the number of peaks you can have in a field like that. And that matches the psychophysical literature. But there are also effects like you can sort of, as you know, so-called resource theory, that is, you can voluntarily or by task focus on one memory versus another. And that's actually something that one can model in these kind of accounts by, for instance, think of the resting level as being something that you can modulate across the field, and then you can make some contents easier to remember than some other contents. But it's still essentially the core mechanism of working memory. And working memory is very critical to all the cognitive models that we'll do, because most behaving and most thinking takes place in the absence of an inducing stimulus. You don't need the visual input from the retina, let's say, to reach. You can close your eye and you can reach. And in fact, more subtly, all the sensory information that is induced by sensory information is transient in nature. Actually, after about 150 milliseconds, there will be no response unless there is a renewed event at the sensory surface. So to understand how we do coherent stuff over the time scale of seconds, we need working memory. So we'll get to that. Okay, that's the solutions I wanted to show. So I showed you the input-driven or subthreshold solutions, the self-stabilized or peak or suprathreshold solution. And I showed how the detection takes you from input-driven to self-stabilized by making the input-driven solution unstable, and the reverse detection instability takes you from the self-stabilized solution to the input-driven solution by making the self-stabilized one unstable. I showed you how the field can do selection, and the selection instability is this the limit on the range of bi, tri, or whatever stable multiple selection decisions, and then there's a limit when the input becomes too asymmetrical where the selection is unique. I showed you how working memory arises, and there's a memory instability in the sense that the reverse detection instability where the peak decays can be present or not, and that is in itself an instability. And I showed you that you can go through detection by just boosting without local input. And I showed you that noise is critical only in instabilities, and it is critical at instabilities. So that's a brief summary of the dynamics of fields. Good. So in our discourse, in the models which you will be tuning and so on, we often talk about dynamic regimes, and that's really what the design of neural networks, of dynamic neural field architectures entails. That you decide different parts of the architecture, what kind of dynamic regimes they are in, and that really means that they have different of these solutions that are stable or unstable, including sometimes their bifurcations, their instability. So sometimes you want a field that is, let's say, in a regime like a perceptual regime. That means it can have a monostable subthreshold state without input, and then go to a monostable peak solution with input, and between those have this bistable regime. And so it's not just having a particular state, but also having the instability associated with that as a function of some functionally significant parameter, like the input it gets from some other field. Similar for working memory, or selective versus multi-peak and so on. And so you will learn how to work with those in the exercises, and then the people doing the projects will be very familiar with that. So it's a little bit of a loose term, because there could be multiple aspects of peaks that we might want to characterize, but it's essentially which attractors and which instabilities occur in the field under functional variation of the inputs of the field. Good. So this that's the core of dynamical field theory, the core mathematical techniques and concepts. What I want to do in the last maybe 15 minutes or so is take you through two case studies. So first, really an example of how models like that are used to explain data, and just give you a rough idea of that. And there's a huge literature, of course, where we have, and a lot of other colleagues have used techniques, models of this nature to account for psychophysical data. And then I wanted to briefly talk about embodiment. If I run too late, I would do that embodiment as the first thing tomorrow afternoon. So this first case study is about reaction time, explaining reaction times in terms of dynamic field theory. And the important point will be that we're not just interested in dynamic field theory about how much information there is being processed, which would be the classical picture, but also what information, what the contents is, what the task matters, which has to do with the embodiment, the link to the sensory and motor surfaces. And I'll illustrate that the decisions evolve continuously in space and time. So here's the reaction time paradigm. Many of you will know that, I suppose. Okay, broadly, people are studying how people make decisions, and very often in the decision there is some signal, like here the stimulus, that's sometimes called an imperative signal. It often contains two contributions, namely it's a go signal, that is now you're supposed to make the decision, and it often also gives you information, like in this case it tells you it's the cup rather than the book that I want you to, let's say, point to or to grasp. And then what people do is do the task that they were instructed or learned to do, the monkey might be learned to do, and we're typically not so interested in exactly the motor response, how to activate the muscles. That might depend on the nature of the motor task, but what we're interested in is when the decision was made to make one particular task versus another. And so we're looking at the onset of the response, measured behaviorally, and look at how much time passes from the application of the go signal to the initiation of the response. We call that the reaction time. Subtly, I'm talking about the onset. So let's say this is instantaneous, the onset of the go signal to the onset of the response. And very critically, often not theorized enough, is the fact that all of these experiments refer to something called a task set. That is, the differences between different conditions are relative to what the possible signals are that you could have. For instance, here I'm suggesting that this participant knows or has learned that there are only two choices, it's either the book or the cup. And then the time it takes to select this object depends on the fact that there's only one alternative, or whatever, fast reaction. Well, if there are many, many alternatives, maybe also alternatives that look very similar, then there might be a longer reaction time, for instance. So all of that literature really has that framing. And this task set is not theorized enough, because in information processing, people often think of these as sort of being objective descriptions of the action that follows. So in our kind of theory, that's very important, because in our kind of theory, we would think of the decision being ultimately some peak generated in an appropriate field, let's say for movement in a field that spans the possible movement parameters, movement directions or amplitude or so, the peak forming there, and we'll be looking at how much time it takes to form that peak. But that time will depend on the state of the field initially when that particular imperative signal, which we call here specific input, arises. And you see in this case, we're assuming that the field is already pre-shaped, so that it already has some activation that anticipates where input may be added. That pre-shape could reflect, that we know how many choices there are, how likely they are, which choice there are, how different they are from each other, and so on. So pre-shape refers to before the imperative stimulus arises, before the go signal arises. So in this simple case, we're assuming it's a three-choice task. There are three possible values of this movement parameter. These CN curves here would reflect those, and the pre-shaped field would maybe be pre-shaped. It's all sub-threshold here, sub-threshold, but pre-shaped over, maybe the center of gravity of these three inputs. And so if a particular command arises, it wouldn't arise on top of a homogeneous flat field in the resting state. It would arise over a pre-shaped field, and therefore the pre-shape would determine what happens. And all the reaction time effects arise from subtle differences in the relationship between the pre-shape and the kind of neural pattern that ultimately will have to be generated to make the response. So here's an example of how we accounted for classical effects. So classically, people asked, how many bits do I have to compute? For instance, the Higgs law is that the reaction time and tasks like that depends on the number of choices. It turns out empirically, it depends somewhat like the logarithm of the number of choices, even though it tends to saturate a little bit. It's not quite linear in this logarithmic plot. This is actually from the model, but empirical data look somewhat like that. And the different curves can be arrived, depending on bearing some other difficulty, like how compatible stimulus and response are. And in the model, we can reproduce that kind of effect. This is actually from the model. And we can understand how that comes about by looking at how the pre-shape differs from the response that you ultimately need to generate. So here I'm contrasting 2-choice, 4-choice, and 8-choice pre-shapes. They're all below 0. Pre-shapes in the sense that the system somehow knows that there are these different choices possible by some kind of pre-shaping input. I'm always selecting the leftmost here just for the illustration. And then you see that the activation in the field, I'm plotting here the maximal level of activation in the field, which will, after a short moment, be here, the one on the left location where the specific input arises. How that depends on the number of choices. And you see that the maximum activation arises earlier for 1, then for 2-choice, then for 4-choice, then for 8-choice. And you put some thresholds here. Then when the threshold is pierced, that would be maybe a crude measure of reaction time. And so in the field, where does that come from? It's a very subtle sub-threshold thing that all these choices here have a slight inhibitory influence on this leftmost peak. Slight because it's below threshold, right? It's only because the sigmoid doesn't go abruptly to 0. It has some kind of gradedness. And so the sub-threshold influence via the sigmoid onto that first choice makes that effect. And then it's interesting that a lot of the psychophysics effects rely on things like that, on the system being close to threshold, so that subtle differences matter. That is, if you tune the parameter of a model like that, you find that the parameter sets that describe human performance well are often the ones that are close to threshold in that way. Some kind of hidden law in human psychophysics like that. So if we tune fields for robotic tasks, we would never allow that to happen. We would make very sharp sigmoids and make it easier for the system. But in the treatment of the nervous system, it's often at the border of stability, which makes some, one can argue for that. I don't want to get too deep into that, but that makes some sense. Now that's, one can really compare that to classical approaches. We did that in our original paper. But it's, in a way, it's a little bit of a distortion, because here we're just aligning this different response to some arbitrary distance, and the distance really doesn't matter for the effect, supposedly. it's much more natural to think in our fields as to ask questions about the metrics. So, does it matter what choices people have to do? And there's an interesting paradoxical effect that historically was, in some sense, a prediction, but it turned out there was data like that in the literature. We didn't know about that. So in the model, we're looking at a two-choice task, but we're contrasting a case where the two choices are far along that space. This is movement direction, versus they are close. Again, this is subthreshold Preshape of the field. And you see in the simulation that the peak level of activation rises earlier for the narrow than for the wide distance. And that comes really from the fact that if you look at the narrow and you take any of those two choices, then you see the level is higher of pre-activation. That really, you see, this activation is helped by that because they overlap, the inputs overlap. And similar, this peak is helped by that peak. And that's how the effect comes about. And this, initially we thought this was strange and counterintuitive because generally you would say that if choices are very similar, it's harder to make the decision, so you should be slower to make your mind. And there is a limit case in which that is true, but that's a prediction from the model. It turns out that that's empirically true. Here's an experiment we never published, but I'll show you a published version in a moment. A very simple motor task that's two choice or three choice, and we just vary the angular distance between those choices. We have to do all kinds of things to make sure that it's not an intentional effect. Just take that for granted. And what you see is the reaction time in this very simple pointing task. And you see that for metrically close choices, you have faster reaction times than for metrically fast choices. Something funny here happening at the intermediate level. So that is true. It turned out that that was in the literature. I moved from Bochum to Marseille, and the head of the Marseille, Jean Requin, when I told him about this, said, "Oh, I have data like that," which he published in the journal Le Travail Humain, which is certainly not a mainstream publication. And the reason he published in this exotic journal, it was a very good study, was that nobody was interested in that kind of thing because it didn't fit the information processing kind of paradigm. And it essentially had an effect like that with very interesting manipulations. Tell you that much. Here's a more refined version of this. So for some theoretical reason, I'm running a little bit out of time. Maybe I'll just make this one point here and then I'll wrap up. So this is doing the same effect as what is called a statistical interaction. There is the so-called Hyman law in the literature. Hyman law says that if you have a choice that is more probable, that's faster than if it's less probable. And the Hick law is sort of a discrete version of that, right? If there are more choices, then the probability of individual choice is smaller. So a longer reaction time for more choices means a longer reaction times to choices that have a lower probability. And the Hyman law can be done generally, like you can have two choices, and if one of them is more likely, for instance, the right one is always the more probable, that is, occurs more often across trials, then you would predict that you're going to realize that choice faster. So for instance, here the higher probability, the pink has earlier rise of activation than the blue one, that difference. And the larger the difference in probability, the larger that difference in activation. That in time course. So here the probability is matched onto the size of the pre-activation. One can actually derive that from the memory trace. I'll refer to that tomorrow. So it arises naturally that the more probable choice has a higher level of activation. So that's the Hyman effect, that this reaction time difference is larger than that reaction time effect. And now here we're predicting an interaction with metrics. That is, if you take that same probability difference, but you move the two choices close to each other, the pre-shaped peaks merge. Again, they're still all subthreshold. And when they merge, the less probable choice is boosted by the more probable choice. And therefore, the low probability choice moves up to the faster response of the high probability choice. That's our prediction. And that turns out to be empirically true. This is an actual published study. We did the same center out pointing task, very simple. And one of those was rare, like every 10th trial, and the other 9 of 10 was frequent, there were more conditions which makes sample space in some way. And we contrast the case where the frequent choice is metrically far from the rare choice, we call this wide, versus where the frequent choice is close to the rare, which we call narrow, metrically close. And so here you see the Hyman effect. Then when in the wide condition, the reaction time is larger for the rare than for the frequent. That will be the Hyman effect. The gray line is sort of like a simple response time that just measures that it's not a question of attention. And the green line is here for the narrow condition. See, in the narrow condition, there is no reaction time difference. And the reaction times are both of the faster nature. So it's this boost that you get for the rare from the frequent. You can also do that in P300. There is a question, addition is bias in DDM or prior. Yeah, actually the Preshape could be viewed as something like a prior. Actually, this is kind of interesting. We did some work on that. It actually throws quite an interesting light on that, because it's only in the very special conditions that these priors matter. And this is one where we're right at threshold and we're looking at a subtle thing like a response time. While in many cases you will make a selection. So if the prior, some parts of the prior are too far from, metrically or in terms of activation level, too far from the choice you're making, then it wouldn't play a big role. So actually I would say that some of the success of Bayesian modeling comes from this unaccounted for subtlety that the nervous system pushes everything close to threshold. So even choices that are not very frequent are tuned to be almost viable so that they can have an influence. Yeah, so maybe the last point I want to make about this relationship to experiment is to actually observe the decisions continuously, right? In the model, in our language, decisions are continuous space-time evolutions of these activation fields, and the discreteness just arises emergently from the interaction. It turns out one can actually observe that directly in behavioral experiments. One way to do that is what is called the time movement initiation paradigm that Claude Guez and his colleagues exploited. It was invented by someone else whose name I forgot in the late 60s, but Claude Guez really elaborated that for other reasons, other motivations. And roughly it just consists of teaching people, training people to respond at a particular time, and that is dictated by a metronome. For instance, you give people 4 tones, beep, 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 and on the 4th tone, you have to move, irrespective of whether you know what to do. And then you can manipulate how much time before that 4th tone you're actually telling the person which stimulus to make. So here, concretely, for instance, in an isometric force production task, there are 6 levels of force, 3 up, 3 down. And people learn that on the 4th they have to move a joystick to reach that level of force, and you only give them a variable amount of time to know which one it is. And what you observe is that there is a time course of the responses. So here on the horizontal axis is that stimulus response interval manipulated experimentally. So you see, if you leave enough time, then they go to the right response. So for instance, here, this is the case where the large force in up direction was required, the middle force, the low force, and these are actually all the error trials. So the 2 conditions are flipped to be in the right direction. And in early trials, you see in early trials, you get categorical errors that they go in the wrong direction, and metric errors. That is, the fast response is required, but they do the middle response. The middle response, is sort of always right, so you just get some sharpening. And here the low response is required, and you get some middle response. And in fact, the categorical errors decrease over time. So you see some kind of continuous evolution. This is a different way to plot the same results, where you could compare, centered solutions. This will be the middle. And then you see the graded evolution toward the correct distribution when you don't start in this default distribution. And I show this because here you see that the distribution of choices can be really centered on choices you never ask for, that are just intermediate. That reflects that it's a space-time continuous system. And so the model accounts for that quite perfectly. This is the same thing. This was isometric forces. This is actually pointing task, where you have pointing direction and pointing amplitude manipulated. And again, you vary something metric about the task, and you have the three groups of responses. Fast is this very thin line here. I'm not even seeing it here right now. I think it's this dotted line here. And then the dashed line is the intermediate time, and then the solid is the longest response. I mean, you see when they're very close, they have a monostable, monomodal peak. So they are making a averaging response. When it's a little larger, they make a averaging response for the very fast responses, but then make a bimodal. So select one of the two for the somewhat larger ones, and then it's bimodal all the way through. And I'm showing this because this essentially can sort of measure, because literally see the distribution, right, in a sense of the, if you interpret it from the model. And this way you can actually measure the widths of the peak. And it turns out that those match qualitatively the width of the peak that you actually see in neural recordings. Some of you might know that you can record from motor and premotor cortex neurons that are tuned to movement directions. Monkey making a center out task, you vary the movement direction. And in that case, neurons in motor cortex, for instance, tend to be tuned to movement directions. So they fire more for some movement directions than for others. These are these restograms. Every mark is a spike. This is time, the preparatory signal, response signal. And actually the response starts here. The hand lifts off the button and lands on the target here, the second one. These are organized by reaction time. And so taking these tuning curves, you can construct a population representation of movement direction. You simply take every tuning curve and multiply it with the current firing of that neuron. This will be these blue lines. And the sum of that is what we call the distribution of population activation. It's a population activation, not over cortex, which in the motor cortex is quite scrambled. It's over movement direction, over the task space. And this is what Jacobs called the population vector, would be where the peak here is. And if you do that by making the current firing rate a time-varying function, you can observe the time course of these kind of activations. And response actually occurs where the activation rises and is sufficiently sharp, but you see some pre-activation if you tell the monkey beforehand which movement it is. And so the width of these distributions and the width that I just showed you match. And so you could say that behaviorally, you're seeing these kind of distributions without your recording. And the interesting thing is these are actually the basis for field theory. So our fields, you could think of this being an approximation of our fields. So rather than anatomical fields in the main, right, it's these distributions over a task space or stimulus space that are the fields. And the interesting thing about that is that if you have these broadly tuned neurons, you see the neurons are not localized in the field. The neurons actually contribute the entire tuning curve to the field. That's a very general picture that I want to use. And so I think I want to close here because I don't want to go through this. Let me show you this thing. This is Paul Zizek and John Kalaska's lab did the same experiment a little later, but they introduced choices that were very, very far from each other, like 180 degrees. And then in dorsal premotor cortex, they were able to see activation at the two possible choices for a while, while the monkey had to hold the response. And then the monkey got a cue which of these two to realize. And you see then, you can see the selection decision happening here. Now the blue choice, which was not selected on this diagram, really going down, and the other one going up. This is actually the distribution of population activation that is combining the response of many neurons in a space that reflects the parameter, the task of what is being shown. So I'll do the embodiment study tomorrow. I want to react to one question that Laura Sainz-Villalba asked. Gradient proportion decision of the decision boundary. Yes, so exactly. So the question Laura is asking is the metric effect that I just exposed. is in conflict with the classical, sometimes called distance effect. And she refers to a particular way of accounting for that by accounting for that in terms of signal detection theory. So it's having a decision boundary in a metric space. It does contradict that, and empirically, you can get the opposite. And we have actually made, explained, I didn't put those slides into this, explained that difference. There's actually a paper which unfortunately not, it wasn't, the critical paper for that wasn't published, never had time to publish that, but I have that in some review paper. So there, remember there are these two things. There is the content, so Preshape and the specific input, which tells us which of the two choices, and there is the go signal that tells us to make a choice now. And the limit case I was talking about here is one in which you still get a very strong stimulus. That is, you can make a selection between these two inputs because there is enough of a specific input, like the signal that tells you which of the two movements to make, that makes a peak that is centered on this peak here, even though both of those were activated, pre-activated. And so that's the limit case, the strong localized input, and not, the boost alone is not enough, because if you did the boost alone, then it would be stochastically either one choice or the other choice that was realized. But there could be another case in which you are supposed to categorically answer. So you don't get an input that is very large to prefer one of these choices. You're actually making some mistakes, and you're forcing the system to respond to one of the two categories. And it's a very large Preshape. So the Preshape really determines which of the two choices you do. So in the extreme case, you would just have these two, the Preshape, and then just give a boost. You would make a random decision. But then you have maybe a little bit of a cue, so that one is a little bit stronger than that. And that is what these classical distance experiments are like. So for instance, in the classical version that was done in the 1930s, you show people two very tiny little sticks, and they have to say which of the two is the longer stick. And the reaction time becomes the larger, the closer the two sticks are in length. Harder to discriminate, right? The response is categorical because they have to pick one or the other stick. And therefore it is dictated by that Preshape in a sense. And what drives it is that when the sticks are presented, it's a boost. It drives, it is a go signal. It tells the system which of the two choices to realize. And it's in that limit case that the classical theory is a limit case of dynamic field theory. But there's another limit case in which it isn't. I'm not sure that that verbal explanation is sufficient to understand that now so quickly. I'm happy to engage into some dialogue about that.